As I mentioned, the opening scenes of The Robots of Death provide the musical themes that are the basis for this suite. Simpson uses his fairly standard orchestration of horns, clarinet and contrabass clarinet, organ, synthesizer, timpani, mallet percussion, and percussion. As you know from your behind-the-scenes insider knowledge, the challenge of this piece comes from several segments made of 3 musical parts that must be played by 2 hands. In the opening segment, for example, the main melody is played by 2 horns harmonized. Answering these horns is a synthesizer counter melody, also harmonized, with a strong vibrato or staccato timbre that I largely did not include. Lastly, percussion, led by the timpani, provides the bass and rhythmic foundations. When you see the score, you'll notice how I chose to write these portions in 3 staffs rather than the usual 2, and indicated which hand was doing double duty. Commencing with 2 measures of crescendoing horns and timpani, the horn melody takes control. At first, it's harmonized in fourths, then an octave, then back to fourths, but soon spends virtually the rest of the section in tritones, providing it with a disconcerting power. The accompanying synthesizer counter melody, on the other hand, is entirely harmonized in perfect fourths. This absolute consistency of intervals is the reason for my educated guess of a synthesizer as the instrument. As I've discussed several times before, synthesizer timbres are often designed with these consistent intervallic structures, most clearly exemplified in Season 8 music, like the Master's theme or the Keller Machine. On the bottom of these 2 melodies is the pounding of the timpani, playing B natural. This note might be played more often than I perform it, but for practical execution, I had to keep it to the most important rhythms. The B bass stays consistent throughout most of this first segment, above the subtly shifting harmony. The general key is B minor, but the first harmonic suggestion is not of any normal minor mode, but of Phrygian, with its lowered second degree compared to natural minor. We've had a fair amount of Phrygian recently, such as in episode 30, Charge of the Sisterhood, and episode 28, Character Development. Because the horn melody is harmonized so dissonantly, subverting the fairly diatonic upper note, it's hard to get a sense of the overall harmony without the contrasting synthesizer line that greatly enriches the texture. Most of the counter line is constructed of fundamental sounds with neighboring sounds surrounding. For example, the opening and most recognizable motif has the fundamental F-sharp B, surrounded with neighboring notes that confirm the Phrygian mode. In the next 2 phrases, similar neighboring shapes occur that suggest B minor 7 flat 5, then C sharp minor 7 flat 5. Towards the end, the melody and counterline join to create the most lucrative harmony yet. Particularly rewarding is the second half of these 2-measure phrases, where the counterline syncs chromatically to resolve on G-sharp-7 and C-sharp-7, respectively. As we come to the end of this louder segment, the horns conclude on E and A-sharp. The bass crash lands on E natural, its first departure from B, while the counterline falls chromatically, suggesting C7 or F-sharp-7. Both chords contain the horns notes. This underscores the shift of focus from the planet's surface and the giant machine to the robot-filled control deck of the Sandminer. Here, the music begins the second of its themes. Although a 3-beat rhythm has been with us from the beginning, this contrasting theme is the true Simpson waltz macabre. The horns become accompaniment, but maintain their tritone intervals, supported by a contrabass clarinet bass line of the same tritones, C and F sharp. This sound recalls portions of episode 14's Blind Man's Buff. Above, the synthesizer continues its melody in fourths, creating a sinister blurring of major and minor. After a bass shift back to E and another falling fourths line, the timpani plays quiet pulses on F sharp, rising at the end. The horns offer diminished seventh harmony, and a plaintive single-note synth line is left to finish this segment. Variations on these motifs, particularly the B Phrygian horn motif, occur in some way nearly every time the Sandminer is seen on screen, although not every version made it into my arrangement. The second waltz macabre motif is found less frequently, but does make important reappearances, as I'll speak of shortly. As an aside, another recurrence is a repeat of the waltz macabre recording a few scenes later in part 1, when the Doctor activates the TARDIS scanner to reveal a metal world outside. This story is musically unusual for its time because director Michael Bryant elected to literally reuse recordings in other scenes. A clear example is the end of this first segment with its plaintive synth melody. The exact recording, not a new musical version reprising that melody, is reused for scenes in parts 2 and 4. The next segment begins as the Doctor and Leela, having emerged from the TARDIS, explore their metal surroundings. The waltz time continues as we alternate 2 augmented chords above the steady F-sharp bass. We presently cut to another view of the Sandminer, and the corresponding motifs recur with one big difference: a sudden shift to duple meter, and this is our first instance of a metric modulation. I first discussed this concept in episode 22, where the tempo shifted seemingly out of nowhere in portions of Spacewalk 1, Course Correction. As in that piece, there is a precise mathematical correlation between the 2 tempos here, and not surprisingly, it's based on the constant of the second. As you know, Simpson used the second as a convenient way of precisely timing his music to on-screen action, at the cost of greatly limiting variety in his tempo choices. Scores from about 1974 onwards invariably used multiples of 60 beats a minute, often 120 BPM. That's the best way to understand these tempo shifts. When waltz time is used, each measure of 3 beats is 1 second long. When duple time is used, 2 beats are 1 second long. The shift to duple time is actually set up by the percussion, which is the first to switch from 3 beats to 4, and then the rest of the music follows. Several metric modulations occur throughout the piece, but the relationship between the 2 tempos is always as I've described. The end of this musical segment, continuing with duple time, underscores the control deck crew, headed by Commander Ivanov, arriving to begin mining the arriving storm. This section features an awesome, irregular rhythm in the muted horns as the crew urgently head to their posts. An irregular, sometimes called irrational, rhythm is any rhythm that seems to deny the underlying meter. The most common type is when a triplet rhythm is thrown into an otherwise duplet feel. This irregular rhythm is extraordinary, as Simpson jams 4 clustered notes in the space of 3, and in the middle of the measure, not starting on the downbeat. The right hand is the horns in my arrangement, poking out these 4 notes, while the left hand continues its steady pulse, and only 3 beats occur under the right hand's 4 before they line up again. This more complex type of irregular rhythm is not unique in my Simpson transcriptions thus far. For example, the 5-beat accompaniment pattern of episode 5's Ambassadors. But this was by far the most difficult for me to execute because of the tempo. It took a lot of slow practice. Watch out for another irregularity later in this piece, a 5/2 rhythm. Meanwhile, the segment comes to a sudden halt after a tritone-laden whole tone scale passage lands on D natural. Next, we move to part 2 of the story and a new Sandminer motif variation found in between the scenes of Leela confronted by, then conversing with, the robot detective D84. Back to triple meter, this compact version has a less rhythmic bass than the original, and comes to a halt with the synth counter melody rising away from C#7, unlike earlier. Later in part 2, the Doctor and Leela are resting in the crew lounge when Leela senses danger. With a wavering ostinato line in the contrabass clarinet, unison horns play long, low notes, outlining E diminished 7th. I included this partially because it was in triple meter, and also because it made good contrasting material. I also used it because it leads into the scene where the Sandminer is thrown off balance, as is everyone aboard. This more dramatic music begins with the Waltz Macabre motif, transposed down a half step as well as an octave. Then, as the bass shifts from B to E, the synth recalls its chromatic neighbor movements, and the horn ensemble contributes some off-balance quartal harmonies over the E bass. As things settle, the tritone waltz beat lightly reasserts. The climax of the piece comes as the cliffhanger to part 2 approaches. The Sandminer is sabotaged, and the control deck registers that the motive units are overloaded and threatening to blow the mine to pieces. And us. Once again, the Sandminer motif commences proceedings, this time in duple rhythm. The ensuing chaos is depicted using the measured chaos of simultaneous duple and triple rhythms. As the horns transform their melody into a mechanistic duplet rhythm, the synth counter melody resists doggedly, remaining in triplet rhythm. When the Waltz Macabre resumes, the bass holding fast to B before returning to the original C bass, the horns are steadfast in their duplet rhythm, and the synth gradually acquiesces, but not without friction. A few phrases briefly slip back into triplet rhythm. After 2 measures, a repeated vamp is established as the harmony shifts up a perfect fourth for 2 measures. This pattern continues 1.5 times, then fizzles as a chromatic synth fall irregularly recalls earlier music. This fall coincides with Dask contacting Toos to report the murder of Borg and the sabotage of the motive units. The musical chaos gives way to spotlight this horrible revelation, and the plaintive synth line from the end of the very first segment, heard solo, heightens the terror. I got a little creative here because the sound effects of the overloading motive units threaten to overwhelm the music from here on. So I decided not to fight it. I added low, throbbing clusters to represent these sounds, intending to contribute to the tension and maintain rhythmic momentum. As the Doctor fights Toos's assumption that they are the culprits, the chaotic Waltz Macabre tries to resume, with the horns returning to triple rhythm, but the synth still is resistant, clinging partially to duple rhythm. Again, there are more musical representations of the throbbing machinery, and on a few occasions you will notice me using the side of my hand in a fist to play these low clusters. Surprisingly, that was the easiest way to play those notes at speed. Tus is convinced to order a halt, and the motive unit's failure to respond is underscored by a harmonized synth solo, which I represent in both hands, rising in triplet rhythm. The longer notes are played tremolo between the hands, representing the rapid-fire synth timbre heard there. The overload almost irreversible, the Doctor plans to fight sabotage with sabotage, and the Sandminer motif returns to beget a series of rising ensemble harmonies over the pedal B bass. These harmonies are generally held over several beats, so more throbbing clusters increase the musical heat. As Dask arrives and struggles to stop the Doctor severing crucial cables, the chords crescendo through a dissonant C7 flat 5 onto open B fifths, as the scream of the title music and end credits begin. In the arrangement, after allowing the final part 2 chord to ring, more throbs usher in the opening music to part 3, as Dask takes the cutters from the Doctor and severs the cables himself. As the throbs crescendo, the horns shout a unison line, suggesting diminished harmony, landing eventually back on B. B diminished is confirmed in the next 2 measures with tense, harmonized figures. To signify the slowing of the machinery, the throbs become longer and more sparse. Next, Simpson suggests this settling by a gradually sinking horn line harmonized with minor sixth that actually create major harmony. That is, until the final B melody note lands with G-sharp diminished harmony, plus a final throb. Cutting to a view of the Sandminer coming to a halt, a pared-down version of that motif returns, and again I use tremolo to represent this synth timbre. As things truly settle, and the Doctor worries that their troubles are just beginning, the horn ensemble repeats staccato F minor chords in triplet rhythm above a contrabass clarinet that alternates long notes F and D. This music signals our first and only extended shift away from B minor. As if to prove the Doctor's point, a staccato D-flat major chord reveals the Sandminer beginning to sink below the sandy surface. And this is reflected in the horns sinking dissonantly from E double flat, D natural, down an octave, landing on D flat in deep bass octaves. Later, in the crew lounge, Leela has tended to Tus's wound, and as the Doctor arrives, Dask announces the repair of the motive units. After a short breath, the horns and contrabass clarinet begin rising in parallel harmony, the melody on the minor third above rocking root fifth. Starting on C minor, we rise in minor thirds through E flat minor, F sharp minor, and A minor. Then, cutting to the Sandminer rising up and out of the sand, the melody forms the major third of C flat major and D major. After a quick F minor, we stabilize on E flat minor for a triumphant return of the Sandminer melodies in that key. Apart from rhythmic variation in this duple meter, the music is literally transposed from B minor. As we view the Sandminer for the last time in the story, the synth counter melody continues to rise, and we resolve through an E dominant 7 to an unexpected and fresh A minor 7. As great as this final music cue is in the story, it didn't satisfy me as an end to the arrangement. For that, I returned to part 1, for a variation where, from B, open fifths, we rise in triple rhythm slowly through some dissonant parallel fifths and conclude with a final Sandminer motif back on the original B, with an added, finally final, bass octave. Thank you, V16. You're probably the only one watching. Part 2 of the Dudley Simpson is Doctor Who Project, episode 33. The Sandminer is long enough to deserve a part 3. Tune in next time for the score to this awesome piece. Subscribe, like, share, and comment. See you then.